Welcome everybody to this Idahobit panel discussion, International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia in conjunction with the British Athletics Pride Network. I am the facilitator for today's session. My name is Shiv Paul and I am a diversity and inclusion strategist and consultant. And I'm really super excited about this discussion. We've got some real heavyweights on the panel who work in terms of change and transformation and D&I, and I'm really excited to get into the meat of Idahobit and what that means, and all things of that nature. So I'd like to introduce my panel guests before we get stuck in. And I'm going to start with Chloe. Chloe Davis is a proud bisexual woman, a mother of two, a creative, a global inclusion and belonging consultant, a chef and an entrepreneur. Chloe volunteers with the UK Black Pride as the head of finance and governance, and she's the community lead for the London Queer Fashion Show, which is an annual showcase of fashion, identity and expression, and is a trustee for the London LGBTQ plus community centre. And Chloe describes herself as a mental health survivor. Welcome, Chloe, to today's session.
Thank you.
Next, we have Martin Smith. Martin is a PwC senior manager who has spent most of the past 15 years supporting his clients to safely transform their technology. He led the PwC Shine LGBTQ plus networks engagement with Pride and associated campaigns in 2019, was co-chair for the London region of the network and is now the co-chair for the network across the whole of the UK. Martin, welcome to today's session. Next, we have Adi Daly Gudial Singh, and Adi is a runner for fitness leader, a clean air campaigner, and advocate for youth access to sports in London. During the day, Adi works in trans healthcare and experiencing life at the intersection of homophobia, transphobia, and racism. It's through her work as a mentor at Spectra London and an activist and spokesperson at Gendered Intelligence, where she provides untold amounts of value to people that she supports there. Welcome, Adi. And we have Lizzie Williams. Lizzie is a British international T54 wheelchair racer athlete. She's also a member of the Athletics Pride Network, supporting the network's purpose to support LGBTQ plus people in athletics. And Lizzie has a quote in her bio, which I particularly love. And it says, "She is a big believer in turning wounds into wisdom and seeing purpose through pain." And I love that a great deal. So Lizzie, welcome and thank you for being part of this panel. So welcome everybody to today's session. I'm really excited to be with you for the next little bit to talk about Idahobit. As I said, it's the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. And let's just get straight into it. I'm going to open this up first of all to everybody and ask, what does Idahobit mean to you? And can you share any personal experiences of discrimination based on your sexual orientation or otherwise?
Absolutely, thank you. I think it's really, especially when we think about this year's theme, it's together, resistance, supporting, but for me, it's also about education. I'm a bisexual woman, so much of the discrimination I face is internal. It's from my own community who don't really understand bisexual identities. I get that typical, oh, well, you know, you haven't really met the right lesbian yet, or, oh, you're just still deciding. And so I think very much is about educating not only about my identity, but also the difference within my own community, as you know, the bisexual umbrella is now supporting so many different identities within that. So yeah, very much about education on a day-to-day basis.
That's great. Thank you, Chloe. Martin, what are your thoughts about that?
Thanks, Shiv. I mean, I guess from my perspective, there's a couple of things. One, there's clearly loads of stuff that we as cis-presenting gay men can do more to support people across the community. We haven't historically been very good at including the whole spectrum of our family, if you like. But I think as much as anything else, we've kind of done visibility for the last 5, 10, 15 years. People have been about for a long time, longer than that, obviously. It's not enough to be visible now. I require to be accepted, and I require that all of the LGBTQ plus family are accepted as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point, actually. You know, I think we are at this stage now, or at the state where we are demanding, right? We're no longer requesting. It's not a request anymore. It's actually really a demand that we are accepted and heard and also, you know, feel visible and valued as well. So thank you for that. That's great. Addie, what are your thoughts about Idahobit? What does it mean to you? Oh, Addie, you're on mute.
Okay, I'll start again. Idahobit. Well, for me, I think it's an opportunity for all of us to highlight that the days of bigotry, they're still with us. For those who wouldn't normally face, you know, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and just to sort of say, well, this is what's happening. This is the kind of thing that we're facing. This is the reality, and join us and help us consign this to the past. But I think it goes beyond that. It's another day of the year that we get to sort of also positively focus in on how diverse, vibrant our communities are, how we can support each other. And we do love nothing more than coming together and celebrating who we are, because I mean the reality is we do face, to varying degrees, we face difficulties, and it's not because of it's who we are, it's what other people think of us. And as a trans lesbian woman, I can safely say right at the moment, I think I feel like I'm one of those who are at the sort of the front at the moment, as somebody who is focused on quite a lot, who shouldn't be in certain spaces, who can't be a lesbian, who can't be a woman. And it was interesting, Chloe, what you said, sort of living in in certain communities where homosexuality and transphobia is just not the norm. You have to sort of deal with that as well. So it's kind of an opportunity to sort of say to the world, look, this is what happens to us. We don't want this. We don't think this is right. We know that's not right. Join us to say it's not right. And this is a perfect day for us to be able to do that.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. And, you know, you touched on something where, which I think it's important to mention. You know, a lot of people would ask, well, you know, why do we need an Idahobit Day? You know, we have so many days for, you know, this, that, and everything, like every day of the year. But, you know, to your point, I think this is a way for us to break down people's perceptions of us, you know, to break down those kinds of stereotypes and things of that nature, and allow ourselves to be seen in the way that we want. So thank you for sharing that, Addie. I think that's great. Lizzie, I'm going to come to you, and I'm interested. You know, you're a pretty good athlete, let's say, but yeah, I mean, in your, you know, profession as a racer, I'm really interested to know what kind of discriminatory experiences you've had, and also how an Idahobit Day may have sort of helped you, you know, maybe deal with those, or provided a kind of avenue for you to deal with those kinds of experiences.
Sure. To be honest, I consider myself pretty fortunate. I haven't come across a huge amount of homophobic or any sort of abuse like that. However, before I was wheelchair racing, I started wheelchair tennis. And unfortunately, I was bullied out of that. And one of the things that was held against me was my queer identity, because I wasn't out at that time. And it was a weird situation, because this person that held it against me was actually LGBTQ plus themselves, which probably made it even worse, really. You know, I thought I had a community within that sport, and a friend within this person who took something very, you know, special and personal to me. And without, you know, I didn't have like my family support and friends, because as I say, I wasn't out. And it really like destroyed me. So coming into the world of athletics, I think it's really important that there is this Pride network, and that we can recognize all these days in the calendar where we can open up these conversations and have that dialect with people from all aspects of sport, from all places. And no matter what level you compete at. Sport should be a safe place for everyone.
Yeah, and you just hit on something that's really fascinating and really important, I think, to mention, that it's also a space for us to kind of educate and build bridges with everybody, even with people in our own communities, right? I mean, there is a lot of kind of discrimination and phobia within our own communities, and so having something like Idahobit Day for me, I think, is particularly important because it does allow communities to come together, and it can be easy to feel a bit sort of disconnected or disenfranchised from, if you're part of the LGBTQ community. But when you're part of something like Idahobit, you do feel like you're part of a movement, right? And you are all sort of fighting towards that same goal of being accepted. So thank you, that's really great. So we were just sharing our thoughts about what Idahobit means. And when I think about this day or days like this, particularly with the last 14, 15, 16 months that we've had, which have been incredibly difficult for people, how do you think an Idahobit Day can help with supporting mental health? Actually, what more can be done by the sport, by industry, or by communities about that? And Chloe, I'm not picking on you, but I want to come to you again first, because I love in your bio that you identify yourself as a mental health survivor. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means, and then how a day like this might help that?
Yeah, so I class myself as a mental health survivor. It lives with me. I don't live with it. And lots of different people will describe how they approach mental health in so many different ways. But my first episode was when I was 24, and I had a complete mental and physical breakdown. And so since then, this is the journey of how I speak about it, and speak about it in a positive way so that it doesn't kind of bring me down. And in particular, when talking about Idahobit and mental health, I think this is a really great opportunity to, I know we're going to touch on intersectionality a little bit later, but actually to talk about what it means as queer LGBTQ plus people who do face discrimination. And again, how I face it is going to be very different to many of the different panelists, because I'm also a Black woman. And so, when I think about not only some of discrimination come from a place of homophobia and biphobia, but also discrimination because of my race, discrimination against, those visible and not so visible disabilities that I may have, and someone's opinion. And so really, I think whenever we're having these conversations about the nuance around mental health, the different way it will impact people, and actually that's in the mainstream, because especially I know within my own community, and I come from African-American culture where we just don't talk about things like mental health. You then add on the other layers behind, just don't make a fuss. When I was pregnant, it was okay, well, just do certain things, and you're pregnant and you're queer at the same time, and having to have, those conversations in the hospital, there's so much behind it. So the more that we can talk about it in the mainstream and utilize our existences in all their abundance, it will mean that days like today won't be so necessary, because actually everyone will know who we are. They will know that we have existed for millennia, and we are just utilizing the conversations around our identities into the mainstream. So I think a day like today should be every day, but if the focus and the eyes are going to be on today, then I hope you're really listening to what we're saying.
Yeah, and also a great point. When you work in the diversity and inclusion space or anything related to that, the age-old joke is you're trying to do yourself out of a job, right? You want to get to a place where we don't need to have diversity and inclusion specialists and things like that.
And I'm the tick box, and every time they're like, oh, she's a parent, she's bi, she's Black, she's a woman, tick, 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 and I'm like, there are so many others. Keep looking.
Yeah. Before I sort of, come to others on that, I'm interested, Chloe, you told us, you shared with us that you had your first episode at 24, and thank you for being so open and honest about that. What kind of words of advice would you give to young people today, as I say, particularly going through this very unprecedented time, not just with pandemic happening and shutdown and not having access to normal life, but also social justice movements sparked by George Floyd's murder and things of that nature. What kind of advice would you give to particularly young people who are really struggling with mental health issues right now because of those things?
First and foremost, be kind to yourself, and boundaries are everything. I work with my therapist on a weekly basis to really put in some boundaries, and for me to just say no. My first encounter was actually at 14, and I silenced myself for 10 years. My family said, be quiet, and so I did. So to our young generation, and the one thing that I have learned is to always keep talking in whichever capacity I can. That's what works for me. Find a friend, find a therapist, but first and foremost, learn how to speak to yourself. And so I would write it down, or maybe even voice note. I know sometimes, especially when we talk around young queer or LGBTQ plus people, that might also come with an element of safety. But my first piece of advice would be just learn how to speak and to give it voice and to give it air, because the more we keep it inside, the worse it will get. And actually, if you feel like you have some form of release in speaking about it, it makes the journey of actually being able to utilize it still hard, but a little easier. It's something that I keep trying to tell myself every day. It doesn't change, but it's a great place to start.
That's fantastic. And, as you all will know, there is a saying which is sort of even more present now with everything that's happening in the face of different kinds of atrocities that are happening, particularly around sort of, social justice around the world, that silence is violence. And we're going to come to that a little bit later in terms of what organizations should be doing or sporting bodies should be doing to be perhaps more active in that political space. But it's also worth mentioning that, silence towards yourself is also violence, right? So your point about, talking to yourself in a healthy way and sort of, in a good and nice manner actually is hugely important. Addy, I want to come to you because, you're an advocate for youth access to sports, but you're a mentor as well, and I'm sure work with a lot of young people. What have you noticed, particularly over the last sort of year or so, in terms of struggles that your mentees are having, and what kind of advice are you giving them, or would you give to anybody who's listening to this?
I'd sort of take it a step back really, and sort of take it outside of my experience with mentees, and focus a little bit on the things that I've been sort of learning over, say, the last 6 months. So my day job is the head of research and development at Gender GP. So we're kind of like we're probably the largest affirming care service and provider in the UK outside of the NHS. And part of my role is actually to liaise with all the amazing groups that are out there who are representing LGBT plus people. And what I'm seeing there is that there's this huge uptick in the number of people that they're speaking to on gender identity. It's for a lot of organizations, it's one of the things that they talk most about now, and the people they talk to mostly are people who are trying to explore their gender, who are in lots of different situations. You mentioned it, Shiv. They might not be in a safe environment. They might not be able to access certain support. But what I think we're definitely seeing across the board in LGBT plus circles is this kind of this increase in the need for people to talk about their gender. And I think that's not great to hear in one respect, because with it comes a lot of pain and heartache and difficulties for those individuals. But on the flip side of that, just knowing that right now at this moment, there are so many places that they can go to. And Chloe mentioned it, utilizing that opportunity to speak about things that are concerning you, things that you need to explore, And I think we're really at a time now where there's LGBT Foundation, there's Belong To in Ireland. I could just run a whole list of them off, where you can access their services. You can do it through text, you can do it through voice, you can do it through video. There's so many different options. That has really been utilized. That mental health care that's available outside of the clinical setting is much more normal now. And what I would say to people is there's probably an option out there for you. And as Chloe said, sometimes that's quite difficult to voice these things, but giving yourself the space to do that is really important. I think the plus at the moment is there's so many organizations that can actually help you. This wasn't the case maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago when people were struggling with things like gender and sexual identity. But now, and it's ironic that there's pushback now, isn't there? There's pushback with certain organizations fighting against the fact that, there's this all-powerful LGBT plus lobby. But why we're actually here is to try and make people's lives that little bit easier and better. So that would be my main piece of advice, because go out there, there will potentially be a real option for you to sort of, even if it's vocalizing for the very first time the things that you need to say, or whether it's, you need you're a year down the line of sort of looking at yourself and asking those questions. Doesn't matter, then there should be an option out there for you.
Yeah, that's great. Something that you just sort of touched on about people becoming more fearful of large LGBTQ organizations and things like that. I mean, it's interesting that we, for a long time, marginalized communities, diverse communities, I think, have been made to feel that there just aren't enough seats at the table for rights. The seats at the table of rights, there just aren't enough seats, right? And so the kind of repression that we're seeing, and I feel like over the past year and a half, particularly after George Floyd's murder, it feels like all kind of communities, marginalized communities, are kind of on a merry-go-round, and they're just taking turns to get off and be the brunt of hate speech and vitriol and things like that. Now, of course, and Black Lives Matter, Asian hate crimes, women here in the UK, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, none of this is new, but I think the global lens on all of these things, that is sort of something new. But I'm hoping that we are getting to a stage where people are realizing that there is enough for everybody, giving the impression that only some people are, privileged to have certain rights is when you're talking about D&I, right, and what we are talking about here, it's a bit like saying, only certain people can kind of have access to the sunlight and that kind of thing.
I think you're right, Shiv. I mean, from my perspective, I was pretty privileged, I guess, growing up as a tall, dark, loud, cis-presenting white man. I've done pretty well. I've struggled with my own sexual identity, obviously, over time as well. But the key for me was to remember always that by giving somebody rights, you're not taking rights off anybody else. And it's that simple. We're looking for recognition, respect, treatment as humans, the healthcare that we need, support in society, and access to safe spaces for all of the things that all humans need. We're not asking for anybody to have anything taken away.
Yeah, absolutely. Martin, have you seen my background actually was my corporate career is in management consulting, and so you and I are very aligned in terms of the work that you were doing around transformation. And I'm no longer in that space in a formal capacity. I'm doing that for myself now. But I'm interested to know, have you seen a shift in the kind of corporate world around corporations supporting not just days like this, for example, but maybe changing working policies or recruiting policies or things of that nature, employee policies? How have you seen a shift there? And I'd also be interested to know, in the work that you have done in PwC and through PwC, through the Shine network, what has worked, or what lessons learned actually rather came out of the start of that journey and so on?
I'll probably start there if it's okay to say that the most important thing that any of us can learn is that none of us knows everything. Because if we're not going to admit that to ourselves, we're sure as hell not going to learn as much as we need to. But I guess if I reflect on the broader question, and I think right back to when I started my career in a different organisation, and I was out with my little team of people who I worked with who joined on the same grad scheme, and then I got a gift on Secret Santa, and it was some hen party straws, and I'll probably leave it at that, which was okay, that's really, really funny, guys. Thanks very much for all the banter. In a way that just wouldn't happen now. And that's not to say that I was particularly affected by it. It was more to say that actually people are generally, I think in the corporate circles I'm moving in, more accepting of people generally and more aware of just kind of what's appropriate. I think as I reflect on what's changed, there's certainly more awareness, although different organisations are at different places. I know some of the work that we've done has been to very carefully think through all of our policies to say where people who aren't conforming to the cisgender norm or the heterosexual sexuality historical norm, how do our policies need to be adapted, updated or changed to make sure that we're supporting people in the best way that we can? I had a message today from one of our team who's looking at policies around our support for people who are potentially going through fertility treatment, for example. Don't know what the outcome of that will be, and it'll obviously go through a consultation process. But the organisation is very much more broadly thinking about how can we make sure that our assumptions aren't blinkering the way that we're thinking about people. And I think that's really important for people to bear in mind.
What kinds of things have PwC done to create a more diverse and inclusive workplace? And I'm kind of interested to see what the sports industry could learn actually from corporations who are, many corporations are quite progressive, as you were saying, in terms of what they're doing. Can you share a little bit about that?
I think we started a journey probably, we started over 20 years ago, but probably the journey I'm most familiar with is the last 10 or so, over which I've at times worked at PwC and at times I've worked at other organisations, but making sure that the LGBTQ plus network in our case, Shine, had a very clear seat at the table with other people in diversity networks, thinking about religion, ability, neurodiversity, thinking about parents and carers, thinking about all of the different aspects of all of ourselves that have particular needs that a corporate needs to be aware of, and making sure that we're connected with a sponsor who's very centrally arranged in the organisation, centrally seated in the organisation, as I say. So our network sponsor, for example, is our UK chairman, who's a chap called Kevin Ellis, and he is the person that we work with on a quarterly basis to say, this is our plan, our progress against plan, this is where we're going from a strategy perspective. Do you agree this aligns with what we're trying to deliver from a corporate perspective? But also, do you agree that you'll support it as our sort of board spokesman, if you like? I think what we've learned over that journey is that actually we all need to do more. So we've continually built that over time, and particularly in response to what's happened over the last year. So you mentioned George Floyd, you mentioned some of the Asian hate crime that's been going on, particularly through the coronavirus pandemic, but all of the other issues as well that I haven't mentioned, to say actually what do we need to put in place from a diversity council perspective, so that as an organisation of 22,000 people in the UK, we are able to understand the perspectives of all of the people who work for us. We do the same as many corporates would do and put out regular surveys to all staff, but actually on a more practical basis, how do you turn that into a sort of working group in action? What initiatives are you actually going to put in place, rather than what could otherwise risk a potential talking shop, so that you get action at the end of the day? It is absolutely important to be heard, I think, on that point, but the end result has to be action, otherwise we're not actually making progress for anyone.
And
so Martin, sorry, could I ask a question?
Please.
Sorry, Martin. Yeah, sure. So Martin, when you say actions, there has to be a sort of an action at the end of the day, and when it comes to LGBT plus progression within the workplace, are you or have you seen experiences of pushback when it comes to sort of pushing more progressive agendas, and have you seen any instances where there are groups within an organization that are saying, no, well, actually, no, I want us to stop there, and I want us to sort of, I want us to think about this, I want us to consult on this, I want us to do A, B, and C before we kind of make that decision. And it might be that, that's the talking is done, the discussion is done, the consultation has happened over the last 10, 15 years, but you're experiencing individuals or groups within an organization that are still fearful of that change?
I think that's a really good question, Addy. If I'm honest, not everybody approaches this with the same passion for change. Not everybody is ready and willing for change, as I think probably Shiv and Chloe would recognise in their day jobs as well. What I have a job to do in my network capacity, and what our leadership have a job to do as well, is to help educate people why it's happening. It's not to question so much, but to educate why. So the example I would use is where people in a position of privilege might, and I certainly have seen examples of this, I should say, might say, well, actually, I don't understand how a levelling up agenda, for want of a better term, I hate to use anything connected with politics, but how something that is perceived to be benefiting somebody else, people automatically sort of feel like that is negatively affecting them. In practice, what we're not trying to do that. What we're trying to do is to make sure that everybody has equity and everybody has equality of opportunity as well. So it is very much an education thing that is needed. What I would round that off to say, though, is that I'm pretty fortunate that our leadership are committed to this. So I tend the questions that I've got have tended to be on a one-to-one basis, where actually, to give credit to the people who've asked them, that they're asking because they're trying to educate themselves as well.
Sorry, I wanted to also add in, there's also accountability, because a lot of organizations, and we're talking about corporate, because there are some, like you said, who will say, yes, do you know what, we actually want to do the work, we want to do the work for all. And then some who are at the very beginning of their journey, but it's about the accountability. And I think coming back to what you said, Shiv, about, as we look towards the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and even in the short term when we see what happened because of the court case, and now we're about to go through indictments again, that many of the organizations who stood together and said, look, this is something that we don't believe in, but also is the work consistent. So I think without accountability, we can't actually really have fundamental change, and that needs to start really everywhere. It's not just a one thing, it's a consistent thing, because as you said, we are the sum of so many things. So if it's not Black Lives Matter, it's not Stop Asian Hate, it's how do we talk about neurodiversity. My son is autistic, so if he wants to be in the workplace, I want to make sure that actually your policies and your procedures, they serve him and not just necessarily me. When we look to our LGBT parents, and remember, anyone can be a parent, it doesn't have to do with biology. So what do you do if your parents are actually your grandparents, or it's an adoptee? All of these kinds of things that needs to be thought of in the workplace. And I think one of the things that a lot of corporates really are afraid of is that feeling of being vulnerable to actually say, I just don't know. Yeah. But it is one of the things that I think has been the most empowering and to be dealt with. So, it's a very small thing, or it would seem like a very small thing, but actually probably one of the things that I've been most proud of. And when you talk about what can athletics do, in my previous role, I was working with an organization for a year who really, we went on a journey thinking about their gendered greetings. Now their services, they serve all the train operators and public transport for the majority of the country. They now no longer use gendered greetings. They will now say, hello, everyone, instead of hello, ladies and gentlemen. Can you imagine if you're on a platform and it suddenly goes, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and you're one of our trans or non-binary siblings? That's really going to impact. So they've now made the choice across their entire business to no longer do this. And when you think about what can sports do, well, actually, when we get back to being into, live sports again, how powerful might that actually be to really think about how do they greet, the consumers that serve. So I just thought it'd be a really good one to kind of pass across, because I was so impacted by the fact that their entire business said, we're going to change everything. We actually didn't realize we're going to change everything, and they've done it straight away.
And what I love about that example that you shared, as somebody whose, consulting career was really focused on transformation and change management, it's actually a fairly simple change, right? Language is so powerful. It's a fairly simple change, but look at the impacts that it's had on you, right? And it's the same, when you talk about change management, actually, there are really quite simple things you can do to make your workforce happier that don't, that you could start doing today, immediately. I think lots of really, really fascinating points there. And a couple that I want to pick up on. And one is, again, this idea that if you are providing rights for one community, you're sort of diminishing rights, for another. I'm paraphrasing you, Martin, in terms of what you were saying. But there is a McKinsey study, and this is from 2020, that says 84% of all workers have experienced workplace microaggressions, which are everyday slights that are rooted in bias. 84%. So you're basically talking about almost your entire workforce is facing some kind of bias or discrimination every single day. And so, we also need to work to change that narrative, where when people are talking about bias or they're talking about discrimination, they're really just talking about Black people, gay people, Asian people. It's just simply not true. And this sort of kind of lends into another point that you brought up, Martin, where, and again, to paraphrase you, what you're doing at PwC is getting a really sort of full appreciation and understanding of everything that makes up and somebody's identity, an individual's identity. We're now starting to touch on intersectionality, right? I was born in India. I grew up in the UK. I've lived around the world. I've been living in Manhattan for the past 15 years. And that in itself, as an industry like the sports industry, how do they talk to me? Am I a brown person? Am I a gay man? Am I, a New Yorker? Am I a British person? Am I British, Asian? And the reality is I'm all of those things, right? So I want to ask you a little bit about this, Lizzie, in your capacity as an athlete, because you had mentioned really being bullied out of wheelchair tennis, right? That's really what happened. How can sport, do you think, cater more to up and coming athletes, or athletes at the start of their journey, to accommodate intersectionality?
I feel like NGOs, NGBs really need to be the ones to create these opportunities to have like communities and groups which particularly support all these intersectionality identities. And as a disabled and LGBTQ plus individual, I face different challenges from being disabled and also being LGBTQ plus within sport, like on a personal level. And to be honest, like just in the last year, being able to get involved with the Athlete Pride Network, just knowing that there is a space when, as I say, not just athletes, but like people from all walks of life within sport can sort of come together and just support each other, just be friendly, but also have these really important conversations. So I kind of forgot where my train of thought was going there.
No, I love it. And, it's going to become more important for the sports industry. I mean, actually for all industries, right? There's another piece of data. I love my statistics in case anybody hasn't realized that already, but there's another study, and I believe this is J. Walter Thompson, but this is from around 2016, which basically says that 48% of 13 to 20-year-olds identify as exclusively heterosexual, right? Compared to 65% of millennials aged 21 to 34, 48%. So basically, what was the minority is now becoming the majority, and that's from 2016. So that's only going to increase. So it's no longer even a question of the sports industry figuring out a way how to accommodate, right, these sort of minority or marginalized communities. This generation is going to be the next generation of athletes, supporters, spectators, consumers, people who are working in the sports industry in that capacity. So I'm interested to hear, you know, from everyone on the panel, what more do you think sport can do in this realm? Because also sport has kind of always wanted to be apolitical, I think, but it never really has been, let's face it. So what comes to your mind when you think about how they need to pivot in order to sort of speak the language of these people who are going to be not just, you know, participating in their activities, but probably also running their business?
Okay,
Start with a small question, Shiv. Sorry, Addy. You go, Addy.
Okay. I think it's a dual approach, isn't it? So Lizzie mentioned that we kind of need the NGBs to sort of really look at the opportunities and say, okay, like you said, Shiv, you know, there's this change now. We're seeing this demographic change in terms of identity, and really they need to look at the opportunities sort of top downwards, you know, in terms of policies and things, but also the other approach to that, and the one that has to work in tandem, is the grassroots up approach as well, and how they affect that, and what part do they play in that. So I grew up, and might give my age away a little bit here, in terms of athletics, watching Linford Christie and our very own Donna Fraser, and watching what they achieved, and you know, that's what spoke to me as a young person, and seeing individuals going out there and achieving in huge ways, and in a sport that was incredibly accessible as well. So you just sling on a pair of trainers, a t-shirt, some shorts, and then hit your local track or go out running, road running. I suppose it wasn't until I got trackside that I really started to appreciate athletics in a more nuanced way. I kind of started to see the segregation within the sport, and seeing that it wasn't just segregated on gender, but it was also masculinity, femininity, sort of age, ability, and class, and race. And it was kind of sort of looking at that and sort of seeing, actually knowing people, not just myself, but knowing people who are kind of struggling to fit in, because we've mentioned the word microaggressions. You know, sometimes there's overt phobias and bigotry. A lot of the time there's, you know, the death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing, where, you know, so look, we'll just make this person's life just not easy, and then they'll just go away because they just won't want to be here anymore. And to a degree, it's kind of still like that, and that's what's disappointing. That's what I find disappointing in sport. So I mean, I've seen quite recently, maybe about a year ago, a Olympian track athlete who, you know, trained on my local track, just posting on Twitter that, oh, so if I decide I want to be a woman, then I can go and win all the women's events. And, you know, sort of a glib remark like that, with absolutely no thought behind it, kind of for me emphasized the sort of some of the toxicity that's around athletics at the moment. And if you're someone who is in a place where some of those protective characteristics that you might have intersect with each other, then it's more pronounced.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about how do governing bodies take part in that conversation? How do they affect what's going on at grassroots level?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, certainly I think, and you're 100% correct, right? I mean, because for a lot of governing bodies, they have to be the change that they want to see. And, you know, for some sports bodies or federations, they may be membership organizations where there isn't a mandated culture, but, you know, you can show what success looks like, and then, you know, enable member organizations with best practices and things like that. So really, yeah, really great points there.
Yeah, I mean, I reflect on that a little bit as well, Shiv. I think there's kind of two things that come to mind for me. One, on that very point there, is to say, reflecting on my corporate experience, one of the things we really clearly did as we set up a business unit, diversity and inclusion council, was to make sure again we had some representation across that as far as we could within our business unit. But at the same time, to make a really clear charter that said these are the things that we stand for, these are things that we all ask, we all commit to personal accountability over, but we also ask everybody who is in our business unit, who we interact with on a regular basis, to hold us to account to as well, and to very clearly set that out as a point of what we're trying to achieve. And I think how achievable that is across sports bodies, I'm not sure, but certainly vision and values that are real and honoured and stuck to, I think, are really important. And I think the second point I was going to make kind of extends from that a little bit, that I live in London. I'm in one of the largest, most metropolitan cities in the world, and it's probably a little bit more open on a non-coronavirus year, but than we've been able to over the last sort of 12 months or so. But I grew up playing, going to school and playing sort of youth rugby in the southwest of the country, where it was a lot less, not a less open society, but a very different society, people with very different experiences, a much smaller group and intersection of people in those environs than I think perhaps, or certainly people were less comfortable being open at that point in time. So I certainly wasn't out when I was at school. I didn't know any other people who were out when they were at school. I didn't know any trans people at that time. I guess my wonder is, and interested in the rest of the panel's views, is how does that translate today when, what's the difference between, say, growing up in London and trying to access sport in London, perhaps, than other parts of the country? How do we help drive the progress as quickly as we need to everywhere?
I think you touched on it earlier. It's all a matter of privilege. You know, we are all people of privilege, although at different passing times. And so, you know, when I think about my childhood, my education, I went to a inner city school, and then you could go to school in the borough that your parents worked. So I ended up going to a very bougie school, and I wanted to play, you know, netball and badminton, which weren't particularly at the time sports that Black people played. It was, you know, you play basketball, you do athletics. And so I think it comes down to that part of accountability and responsibility of these bodies, whether you are membership driven or not. Who's not there? You know, who is, because you're catering for society now. We're not catering for particular groups of people. So again, I think when it comes to that part about accountability of not what we've always done, but actually the world is vast. And in the world, there are so many different nuances of people, so much difference. So if you're not catering for that as part of your ethos, your mission statement, your vision, and then if they're not part of your governing body and they're not there, then you're making space for them when they do show up, or you can find them. I think that has to be the goalpost now, because for a lot of those of us who are more marginalized, we have been the ones who have set the precedent, have been the onlys, the benchmarks that everybody else has then been judged behind. And I'll be really honest with you, we're tired. We still do it because it's important, but I'd like to get to a point where I don't then have to keep being this benchmark, and I will be 40 next year. You know, I'd like to get to living and actually thriving and not just continuing to survive. Yeah. And so, you know, when I think about, like I said, Black and brown people, but also our trans and non-binary. When I think about neurodiversity, I've seen these people in sports my entire life. Like, I've either gone to track and field, or I've been in a group, or, you know, I've my godbrothers are Olympic trampolinists, and I knew what it was like for them when they were the only in their sport. And when I think about where we're at now, I can still name only one or two on a hand, and not the abundance of talent that is out there. So it's not our job to keep explaining. It's really now those bodies to get it, because what's going to happen is all of this amazing talent that we home grow, that has been here and continues to be here, will go elsewhere, and it will go to another country, or it will go to another connection, and we'll lose it. So yeah, I can't play the nice politics, because, you know, my children will be this next generation, and I want them to have access to everything. So if we don't collectively try and change it for not only my children, but, you know, if this whole panel had children or related to children, you know, this next generation to come, that's got to be how it's done. And like I said at the beginning, time for waiting pretty much over. Like, now we actually have to get to doing, because if we don't, we'll keep having this conversation in the next 2, 5, 10 years. And then what? You know, then the Americans and everybody else will be, you know, so much further ahead. And we have so much talent here.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. First of all, you know, you're going to be 40. I mean, you're just a baby. I can't even remember what it was like to be 40. So, you know, you have.
Yeah, but you don't look 40, Shiv. Be quiet. Don't even look close.
That's my ethnic origins, and it's
the melanin.
Good lighting, I think. But, you know, I love what is being said here, because, you know, one of the sort of underlying themes of all of this, you know, we talked about accountability and holding others to account, but it's also accountability of self. You know, we have to hold ourselves account as well. And really, that is connected to increasing your level of emotional intelligence, right? And that comes from becoming more self-aware. So becoming more self-aware comes from checking in with yourself. Why do I think or feel what I think or feel? You know, what is really behind that? And I think, in some ways, I think it's a bit unfortunate, the day and age that we're living in now. I love technology; it allows us to do this, but we're also living in this world where you're able to reach a vast amount of people who, candidly, are not always operating with a high level of emotional intelligence. You know, Addy, a lot of the comments that you were making, I have to, you know, bring up Caitlyn Jenner's comments recently, and I'm laughing about it, but it's really no laughing matter. But that's a very explicit display of a severe lack of not just emotional intelligence, but intelligence in general, right? So, you know, for me, I think that's sometimes the sort of difficulty with, you know, how do you use the platform to get your message across? But then that also comes with attracting, you know, a lot of people who don't want to be educated, or they don't want to be informed, or they don't want to ask why, you know, what is behind this, or so on and so forth. I think that's a bit of a challenge, right?
It's definitely difficult. And I think you get to a point, don't you, where so if we're talking about, you know, sort of things like internalized transphobia, and, you know, that we probably see demonstrated by comments that Caitlyn Jenner has been making recently. And you're right, there is a sort of potentially a lack of awareness for that particular individual, just because, you know, we are living in a time where everything's digital. So in one breath, the person is saying that I don't think trans girls should be in girls' sports, but then we see her reportedly taking part in women's golfing tournaments, and also having the privilege to access women's space because of the position that she holds. I mean, who's going to refuse Caitlyn Jenner going into a women's only space? I think that, you know, there'll probably be few people who will be brave enough to do that, and that talks of a privilege. And then basically to sort of pull up the drawbridge there, and then talk down at everybody else who's coming after you, who isn't in the same position you are, you know, really smacks of a lack of potentially self-awareness, but emotional intelligence, as you say. But I guess when you look at extremes like that, and then you go to the further extreme of people who just don't want to listen, that's almost where you have to leave it. They don't want to listen. It is a genuine waste of time talking to them, because it doesn't matter what you come with. It doesn't matter what experience you come with, what level of facts and information, you know, how many proven peer-reviewed studies there are to, you know, to put your that back up the point that you're making. It just doesn't matter to them. So at some point you have to say, well, you are definitely not my audience here. And I guess what we take from the good thing to take from that is that almost every single ipso mori poll that we're seeing coming out that hasn't been commissioned by a, you know, an invested interest is saying that, you know, people couldn't care less if somebody was LGBT plus. You know, they really couldn't. They're probably related to, friends of, or whatever anyway. So they have that lived experience as well, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that shift in demographic. This group of people who are kind of sort of protecting something that doesn't exist anymore, arguably, they're just not our audience, and we shouldn't be wasting. My opinion is we shouldn't be wasting time on them. We should going back to the beginning of our conversation about, well, where do we put our resources and our effort into making sure that those without rights get a fair share of the pie of equality and equity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to reason with somebody who is not rational or has no rationale, right? But I do think something that you just touched on, I think, is very key, and it's really around what are people really fighting against? You know what? And this is why, you know, comments like Caitlyn Jenner's just really irritate me, because you're right. Who is going to refuse her? You know, going to a bathroom or that kind of thing. No one's going to stand up to her. Meanwhile, we're probably all aware of, you know, anti-trans bills that you know, are being passed and have been passed in the US and things like that. But for me, it's really a distraction, right? This is not, they're using this to distract people from the fact that they don't really want to have to deal with all other kinds of restrictive policies that are currently already in place. It's sort of, you know, the whole argument is we have to protect girls, we have to protect girls' sports. It's like, well, then why don't you implement equal pay? Or why don't you allow women to do what they want to do with their bodies in certain states and that kind of thing? It's like, it's kind of all a smokescreen for me in some way, which I think is based on fear. So yeah, I mean, but as you say, that is sort of the challenge of the digital age that we live in, where you have to deal with, you know, with a lot of unsavoriness in order to get your point across. But I think you're right, Addy. It's sort of, it comes back down to, and this is also sort of connected to what you were saying, Chloe, after all this time, what is the battle that we really want to fight, right? That's where we should be focusing time and attention on, right? Resources, accessibility, things that people need in order to feel safe, to feel valued, to feel, you know, protected. Let's talk a little bit about sport and politics. You know, I mentioned that before, and it's sort of a kind of segue. I mean, certainly we've seen in some instances in the states, right, with restrictive legislation, let's say in certain states, sporting bodies boycotting those states, pulling their events out of that because of, you know, restrictive voter legislation. And I'm going to come to you again, Addy, because we were talking about this in our prep call the other day. But you know, you brought this really great point that we haven't really seen companies or organizations or sporting bodies kind of get behind the anti-trans bills in the same way, right? Why do you think that is? And like, what would be a good show of support from these sporting bodies in the face of these restrictive legislations?
I don't know. I honestly feel that the sporting bodies and those companies that would ordinarily, you know, the very companies that kind of on Pride Month trade on it heavily, you know, and go out with all sorts of colors, and we see, you know, companies creating LGBT trainers and you know, and things like that. We're kind of not, we are definitely not seeing them react to the slew, the hundreds of anti-trans bills in the United States at the moment. And you know, it's far, you know, it's way above my pay grade to really understand it. But if from a layperson's point of view, I would say it's because potentially they're looking for federal government to sort of save the day on this one, because obviously on one hand you've got Biden government that's very on the face of it inclusive and is saying all the right things, and only yesterday announced, you know, again, you know, that they're sticking by trans people, and I guess there's that, right, okay, they're gonna save the day, they're gonna sort of wind back all of these laws, make them illegal within themselves. So actually you will be able to, in that state, compete, and you will be able to get medical care. And so if that's the case, it's a lot to put it on the federal government, and it's a lot of faith in the federal government. And we know that, you know, sort of money talks. We know, you know, people will vote with their feet. We, you know, on a sort of more micro level, we saw it with Flora, for example, a few years ago, when, you know, they pulled their funding from, you know, one of the sort of mums boards online because of, you know, transphobic conversations going on, and you know, they pulled that. And we saw it with, you know, supermarkets, and, you know, we saw them doing these little things, and we saw how actually that works. So I'm hopeful at some point there will be this awakening. And I know that a few sporting bodies, so I think it's the American Athletics Association, or the I think it's the collegiate one, have said that, you know, I think it's in Arizona, I believe, that they, you know, they won't be having their event in Arizona whilst they have these draconian anti-trans laws. But we need to see a lot more, because, you know, that's what people react to. And obviously people react to that in two different ways: a supportive way, and then well, that's just another organization that's being captured by the, you know, by the woke people. But again, they're not the audience, and they're not actually the audience of, I think, the majority of society.
I think there's loads in that, Adi. I mean, I think the way I kind of view that is going back to role modeling almost. We are looking for role models in the States in particular right now for people and companies to be able to stand up and say, actually, we're not going to stand for this, in the way that, when my own personal example, when I was a grad at a blue chip company, I was looking for someone, in my case, who was a bit like me, who was prepared to stand up and be vulnerable and say, actually, the vulnerability is, this is what we believe in and we're going to stand by it. In my own case, it was a gay person who was successful and senior in their job, and I couldn't see that when I began. What we're looking for in terms of role model organizations is, like we've been talking throughout, I think, vulnerability, accountability, being prepared to stand for what they believe in and take action. The politics of the US, I'll hold my hands up and say I don't understand in great detail, but it does feel, with so many different parts of legislature that kind of sits across state and federal and almost county level at the same time, that it's complicated. But I hope we make progress, and I hope we make it fast.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand in some ways why sporting organizations, I think, are finding it tricky to understand who they are in this current world. You know, I think they don't really understand where to draw the line in terms of vocalizing support and things like that. And I've had a few conversations with, you know, some of the sporting bodies that I work closely with about this, particularly, you know, are you planning to put out a statement about the rise in Asian hate crimes? You know, are you going to make a statement about Black Lives Matter? George Floyd's, the anniversary of George Floyd's murder is coming up. What has been done within this last year? What are you planning to say about that? And I think for a lot of them, it sort of comes back to a lot of what we spoke about before, where they don't have the answers. and actually that's okay, right? The first starting point is like, start to figure this out. Let's figure this out. Look for resources, look for help where you can make that happen. So, in that sense, I sort of understand that. But actually, what I have kind of come to the conclusion around, and this is sort of where all of the conversations I've been having with those organizations end up, is it's basically a human rights issue, right? There are no pros and cons really to decide whether you should vocalize support or not. It comes back to something we were saying before, that actually silence is a form of violence. And in the way that we were saying that, we are demanding to be heard, to be seen, to be visible, to be accepted. I think it's dangerous. I'm interested to know what all of you think. I think it's dangerous for sporting organizations or organizations in general not to have a comment or political voice in the face of what's happening, because there's no separation now in the world that we live in between that. There's a political agenda that underpins everything. Thoughts?
But I don't think there ever was. The reality is the rest of the world is just waking up. Our very beings are political. So, it's now we have a vocabulary for it, but the education piece is so vast, because, when we have people talking about us as, LGBTQ plus people, I almost every time want to remind people, but how did our movement start? We would not have a movement if it wasn't for the trans community. So the very thing that you're trying to deny is the very reason why you can put a rainbow and our colors on merchandise. And so you have a responsibility regardless. When we think about our intersex siblings who've been around for time immemorial, we have different words to describe who they are, but they were still here. So the problem now is, if you don't say something, if you don't stand up and be counted for those who are in your structures or for those who are not, the community will do it for you. And unfortunately, you then lose the right to be able to do it in an informed way. You end up being reactive instead of proactive. And so, for all of those organizations who, came up and stepped out for Asian hate, came out and stepped up for Black Lives Matter, who, passively talk about, the trans community, but aren't that aren't, I have a very, this stems in everything to allyship, although I hate the word ally. I prefer the word co-disruptor. That's my own personal choice, because in allyship, what are you actually doing? And to bring it back to sports, regardless of whether it's an individual or a team sport, you are still a team. You still have a coach. You still have at least one other person that informs what you're doing for your discipline. So when we talk about allyship for the sports community, if you're not showing up for everyone, your coach could be LGBT, they could be straight. Still have to listen. You still have to respect that person. You still have to celebrate their difference, because they're trying to make you the best person that they can be. So as a sports body, the time for saying, well, we don't really know, it's over and done with. And actually now, what are you going to do about it? And you need to educate yourself. You need to celebrate the many differences that you might not see, learn. If it's not in front of you, go out and find it. Because the reality is, if it's not there, with the internet now, there'll be too many people that will say, you didn't do this, and we know that you didn't do this because on this date and such, and history is unforgiving. So we actually have to go back to re-educate ourselves on our history, our her story, and our their story. Where did we come from? What is it about our disciplines that make the sports what they are? And let's get back to educating everyone on where it was, where we are now, and where we hope to be. And that's the only way that we're going to do it, and do it together. And that's just not for sports. That's everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
absolutely.
none of us got here on our own. And I think that's the one thing I wanted to talk about when we talked about role modeling and visibility is, in whatever light I may have, I didn't get here on my own. So it's my duty and my responsibility to keep continuing to hold the door open for all of those will come behind me, but also who that don't have the access, how am I helping them get there? And that's the job for the 5 of us, sports bodies and beyond. That's the only way we're going to change the world, at least for my children and other people that look like that. And I have to do that so that Squeaky over here gets, you know, gets the opportunity to go and do that. You know, how do we help other people? I can't just go, well, you can't see him, so I'm not going to count him in. I have to.
Yeah. So
I totally agree with you. I kind of reflect on my own mental health journey over the last sort of 5 years or so, and where I mentioned I had a colleague who was a role model for me, and I kind of didn't really reflect on how that replayed itself into my corporate work, probably until the last sort of 5 years, where actually I worked for a different organisation, and they were very visible in their support, but it didn't really feel like we were making much progress. And we talked quite a lot about actually what would we change if we were in a position to do something about it. Well, now I am, but the reason I really stood up to become counted was because that particular person unfortunately got really sick, passed away, the same year that I lost my dad. And I kind of said, well, actually, I'm not prepared to sit and watch anymore. And I think from the mental health side of things, and having some time out with depression and all of those sorts of things that happened over the same time, the opportunity that I have as somebody with all of those experiences is to use it to power me for change, where, it was pretty awful. Lots of people go through pretty awful things, but if I can help one person, and I've had conversations this year that are incredibly empowering, where people are struggling with coming out or potential health issues that they've had, life experiences that you wouldn't wish on anybody, but they have had a visible role model in the business. The same parallel would work for sport, where actually they felt able to come and have a conversation. And the very act of helping one person, because I've been visible and open and vulnerable to a way that I'm confident being, although it's not easy first time, but you learn to get better at it. The very act of helping that one person is part of my own healing, and I find incredibly powerful, and it's really important as well.
Yeah, I love this. Thank you for sharing, everybody on the call. So we have the last sort of several minutes of our fantastic conversation, and I would love to close with all of your thoughts around, if we were to give some advice for anyone who's listening to this, whether it's an individual, whether it's an organization, whether it's a team that's interested in being involved in this agenda, what tips and tricks could we give them? How could they get started right now? So we've mentioned a few things in terms of getting educated and having, access to resources, do some research. Certainly there are lots of trainings and things that people can do, but I'd love to hear from each of you in turn. What are maybe 3 tips or tricks you could tell people where they could actually just sort of get started right now? Lizzie, let's go to you first.
All right. This isn't a tip or a trick, more of a food for thought.
Okay.
I think we all need to acknowledge that there is very likely a sad reality that the sporting world has denied members of our beautiful LGBTQ plus community the chance to pursue careers or just get involved in sport, and whether that's as athletes or coaches. Just imagine how much richer sport would be if we embrace people of all identities and life experiences.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. Addy, what about you?
I think my advice to NGBs would be, when you are considering sporting policy, and let's say you're considering your sporting policy on access to the sport for trans people, for example, and you're you're hearing things from 2 different camps, a sort of pro accessibility and a sort of no, don't let trans people access this sport within this category, is actually understand what the issue actually is. So we have England Rugby running a consultation at the moment, and we have them sort of announcing that they're probably going to ask any trans woman that's over 170 centimeters or 90 kilos to go through a whole assessment and potentially not be able to sort of be able to take part in the women's game. Is there actually an issue there? Is there a problem there? It's not a problem that I've heard people with it, rugby people talk about, these trans women sort of dominating the sport and and injuring. There's a lot of problems with women's sport, but I think it's fair to say that trans women aren't part of the issues. There's issues with funding, there's issues with safety, there's issues with equality. Trans women aren't. So kind of understand what the issue actually is. And then for individuals who kind of want to be empowered, want to go out there and advocate and be an activist, is, I would say, don't take on too much. I think, Chloe, right at the beginning, you said about sort of being able to say no to stuff is really, really important. To approach things in a way that's manageable for you, because it's okay to be angry about stuff. Anger is part of how we make change, and but it's kind of understanding that and just giving yourself the time to concentrate on the things that you think are important, but again, giving yourself permission to do it as well in a way that's right for you and not necessarily right for all of those people who are pushing you into something.
Love that. Thank you, Martin.
I mean, apart from echoing what Lizzie and Addy have already said, I guess for me, three things. One of them, I can't remember who it was earlier on, but I think somebody mentioned being kind to yourself. So it's certainly one of the biggest learnings I had over the last 18 months, including through my time out and all of those sorts of things. I think a second one, I always come back to the fact that at the end of the day, if you're measuring on a people for people basis, the only thing that all of us have in common with everybody else on the planet is that we're different. And what we're trying to do is to give everybody that equality and equity of opportunity. And then finally, I just leave it on something that my friend Darren, who's the friend of mine who passed away, inspired me to kind of see and believe, and that's doing my best to be the change that I want to see in the world. I won't always get it right. I absolutely won't know everything, but I can sensitively listen, question, and be an advocate and a change actor in what we're doing rather than a passive rider along.
Thanks, Martin. That's lovely. Chloe.
Apart from everybody else, my three: Google is your friend. It's okay not to know, and it is more than okay to ask. I think that we need to not be afraid to ask each other. My ask would be for Addy, for Lizzie, what more can I do to help amplify you? What more can I do for you, Martin, and for you, Shiv? And we need to get back to that sense of community, but make sure that it comes from a place of learning and that we've done a bit of the work first. It's not the responsibility of those most marginalized to be the key and the answer. So we've all got to help each other.
I love that. Thank you very much. I will close with two thoughts, two comments. One is I do a lot of work with the Federation of the Gay Games. And the Gay Games is the largest sports and cultural event that's put on by LGBTQ people, but which is open to all in the world. And the reason I mention it is because of something Lizzie mentioned in her closing comments about, and it's been mentioned during the course of this call as well, people who may, have left the sport behind or, never got involved. And I get asked all the time, why do you need a Gay Games? Why do you need something like that? And I think it's really for two of the core reasons are that, right? It allows people who perhaps left a sport because they were bullied or they didn't feel they belonged or, they felt discriminated against to come back to it. but it also allows people to actually take up a sport that they never entered into because of the same kinds of reasons and things like that. So, you know, I love the fact that it is truly inclusive, and there is a space for people to just be who they want to be their authentic selves without judgment or reciprocity and things like that. And then I will close just by repeating something that Martin said, and I will use the phrase that you put in the chat pod when we were all chatting. At the end of the day, difference is really the only thing that everyone has in common. And I think that's a very simple and beautiful way to put things. It's actually not our sameness that unites us. It's really the fact that we are all different. We are all diverse. We are all beautiful. So I really want to say thank you to all of my panelists, Chloe, Martin, Lizzie, Addie. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to spend this last little bit of time with you talking about Idahobit and all of these really wonderful things. Thank you to everybody out there who is listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this. And once again, thank you so much and God bless.